Tim Stroshine from our staff, along with Woody Woodruff, have been leading this effort on e-scooter operations and ADA compliance. And Tim, not by choice, is sporting sort of a piratical look for a while, and whenever he's ready, he can begin.
Hello, everyone. As Sally said, my name is Tim Stroshine. I work here in Tippecanoe County, and I'm here today to share with you what the MPO e-scooter operations and ADA committee is doing. So I think all of us have kind of felt this slide if we've been in an area with electric scooters. I think this was especially true when they were kind of first deployed. You know, these things went from not even being on some of our radar screens to being everywhere. And it was really quite a shock to a lot of people, a shock to our system, really. So a lot of work had to be done very quickly to kind of adapt to those. And so what I'm going to share with you today is kind of about a e-scooter operations and ADA committee. So just to let you know what it's about, how it was formed, what kind of work we're doing, and then I'm going to relate it to sustainability and resilience and how it ties into those things. So first of all, just a quick history, sort of a timeline of how this committee was formed. It really started, I think, in my opinion, in March 2019, where there was an FHWA meeting about e-scooters and ADA. So that meeting included representatives from industry, government, and advocacy. So we really had quite a good cross-section of people there that were able to get together in one place and talk about just some of what was going on with e-scooters and their operations and what issues were developing from different perspectives. So issues from the industry's perspective, from the perspective of local governments, as well as advocacy agencies. Then in September 2019, at last year's MPO conference, kind of the idea to have a committee about this where representatives could get together on a regular basis and discuss what was going on in their area and kind of be a place where we could collect resources for those that are maybe just starting to get e-scooters for the first time and wondering, okay, you know, there's something we have now that we didn't have before. What can we do about that? Where can we find some resources? Where can we find some help? So in March of 2020, this committee had its first quarterly meeting, and we've had 3 total meetings, and our next meeting will be in December. So we're on a pretty good track with that. So as far as the committee's composition, it's made up of, I think, a lot of types of people that you would expect. So there are representatives from MPOs, from INDOT, from Federal Highway, as well as nonprofit community organizations. Health by Design is a good example. We have some representatives from them. I think the one that may surprise people is the 4th one there, the transit providers. You may wonder, well, what sort of stake do they have with e-scooters and these micromobility type of devices? Well, unfortunately, when people use these types of devices to get to bus stops, they often tend to not be very courteous about where they park them and how they transition from the device to the transit device. And that can be very challenging for people with mobility impairments who then also need to get on a transit vehicle. So they have more of a stake than you might think in this. So as far as what the committee's goals are, this is our mission statement. As mission statements tend to be, it's a little bit wordy, so I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but I am going to kind of just mention that there are basically 2 different parts to this. So kind of the first part talks a lot about developing equitable policies to ensure that the rights of people with disabilities are respected. That's part 1. And then part 2 is to accomplish that goal through doing things like outreach, education, and making sure that we have good data available that we can study and then use the data to put together some recommendations and ways we can accomplish some of our other goals. So the committee right now is working on a few different things. These are some of the highlights. So the first one is an ideas table for resolving ADA issues. So I have to give all credit to Ken Woodruff for this. He really was the driving force behind putting this together. And it's something that we have currently available. If you're interested in it, I'm more than happy to send it to you. I'll have my contact info on the last slide. So when we get there, we'll be on there for a little bit and you can feel free to jot that down, or if you're looking at the presentation later, certainly that, you know, it's there, and I'm more than happy to send that to you. And I also do have some examples from that in upcoming slides. So then the second thing is a micromobility ordinance development checklist. So what that is going to be something that's a resource for people that are just starting to get e-scooters or other micromobility devices in their area. So someone comes in, you're approached by a provider who wants to deploy some units in your area. So, well, what do you do? What have other people done? And that can be a pretty daunting task to kind of try to dig all that information out yourself. So what we're trying to do is get some kind of general recommendations, best practices, those sorts of things, so that can be a resource for anyone who's starting to get some new micromobility devices. And then the last thing that I want to highlight today is data collection and standardization. So one of the great opportunities that these types of devices provide is the opportunity to get some really good data about how people are using the transportation network. But if we don't know how we're collecting that data, and if it differs a lot from area to area or provider to provider, then it might be a little bit hard to leverage for our planning purposes. So as a committee, you know, we wanted to kind of get together and see what we could do to make sure that we're all on the same page with that, and we're all getting good data that we can use for our planning purposes. So the next couple of slides are going to be all about the ideas table that I referenced. So this first slide just kind of shows in general what you'll see on each of the next few slides. So the first header is just the idea, so what it is. So that's how to resolve an issue. And then the next three columns, we have our implementation, the cost of implementation, and a time frame. So those are all ranking columns. There are 3 different ranks for each of those 3, and it just kind of lets you know how much effort, cost, and time it would take to implement a particular solution in your area. And then the final column is who will be responsible for implementing this. So it could be local government, it could be industry, it could be advocacy agencies, or it could be a partnership. And we're going to see some examples of each of those on the next couple slides. So our first example is to put together kind of a message for mayors or government officials to deliver to the public. So specifically, this message would be about encouraging people to just properly park or leave e-scooters in such a way that they don't block the sidewalk. So you may have, as you've been traveling around, especially when we were in the pre-pandemic era and the e-scooters were a little more prevalent, you would often see in certain places the e-scooters were parked pretty well, pretty uniformly, and then there were other times when they were not. And when they're not parked uniformly, if they're kind of strewn all over the sidewalk haphazardly, that's a really big deal for someone with a mobility challenge. That person is not necessarily easily able to get around to where they need to go. They may have to backtrack, to go way out of their way, just to do something as simple as get to places they need to go for their everyday life. So this is the sort of thing that's really pretty easy. It doesn't take too much effort. It's something that just takes a little work to draft, and then just a little bit of partnership between whoever would be writing up the message and then whichever elected official would be delivering it, and then you have that. So then the next idea is one that's more on the industry end. So this would be about getting certification for their employees. And it also mentions there in the ideas that no uncertified individual may work for an e-scooter company. So that also kind of gets into a little bit of policy in your area as well. So that obviously, anytime you're talking about this sort of effort, it does take a little bit longer than the first one. It's more of a medium effort or medium implementation sort of thing. And the cost, though, is still pretty low, relatively speaking. And the time frame can be pretty quick, but to actually get it on the books and to get it enforced does take a little bit more doing than our first idea. So the next one would be an advocacy sort of idea, or would be more on those types of agencies. So any kind of disability or livability advocacy group could develop a grading or a rating system where vendors can apply for that rating, and if they are conforming to best practices, then they could get this certification saying, that they are certified as a gold level, whatever. And then from there, that can really kind of be a great thing for them to publicize. Unfortunately, this one is a little bit more of a long-term thing. This would take a lot more effort. But sometimes putting in a lot of this kind of effort, it really is worth it. So even though this is, from the examples we've seen, one of the more difficult ones to implement, I think it certainly would have a lot of benefits if it could be put together. All right, and then our next one is kind of a partnership. So this one does take medium effort and have some costs, and it would take a little bit of time to implement. But just kind of geofencing or geocoding e-scooters so that it limits where they can operate. So the example given here is it's okay for them to be ridden in a bike lane, but once they are on to the sidewalk, then the motor would essentially shut off, and that would not allow people to use them on the sidewalk, which is a big concern in many cases. So this also does have a kind of a technology component where it requires the e-scooters themselves to have that technology built into them. So that's another issue that would take a little bit of time to work through, but this is a great example of how using technology could really help to improve the situation for a lot of people. All right, so then our next item that we've been working on is an ordinance checklist. So this is still a work in progress. The work is being led by Health by Design and NDOT. They're kind of partnering together to be the point people on this. So thank you to both those organizations for that. What they've done so far is they've done a lot of research on ordinances, not only in Indiana, but also just what some best practices are nationally. And one thing that we're not quite sure about yet, but we're hoping to get to, is that it may include some boilerplate kind of language. So when places start to develop ordinances that haven't had them before, they can say, all right, what can I use as a baseline, as that boilerplate for our ordinance? What's been effective in other areas that we can use, and kind of really reduce some of the stress and the time component it would take to put one of these types of ordinances together from scratch. So I have here just one example of a portion of this checklist. It might be a little hard for you guys to really get a lot out of this because it's just a lot of bullet points. But what it's trying to say is, so there are several different items you may want to include in your ordinance. You may want to include information about, for example, the maximum number of operators or the maximum number of devices an operator can deploy. What are the specs for those devices? What about the data sharing requirements? What data are we going to require the companies to share with us, and in what format do we get that data? Those sorts of things, as well as ADA considerations, specifically about parking. And an example that we have here, this was pulled from an ordinance in Long Beach, California. It's there in italics. I'm not going to read it to you, but I think it's a pretty good general example of what you would look for in terms of getting a policy that really complies with good practices and serves the community and helps people with ADA challenges and mobility issues as well. So that's still a work in progress. There's still a lot going on with that. More to come on that, but we're off to a good start on that, and we're glad to see the work that's being done, and we hope that that will continue to be something that's just really helpful to anyone who might need it. All right, so data collection and standardization. This is another work in progress. And one of the biggest issues with this currently is how to code e-scooters in crash reports. So this has kind of been something that has really been a challenge to work through. Last I've heard, we're still not 100% sure what we're going to do with those and how that's going to be coded going forward, especially in ARIES, which, as any of you who work with crash data know, that's the main source of data that practitioners use is here in Indiana is ARIES. So we'll see what happens with that system, but no matter what happens with ARIES, this is something that's going to take partnership with our law enforcement personnel, and we're going to have to get together and make sure that when the report is written that everyone knows, okay, what do we expect in terms of data from an e-scooter crash? How are we going to code them as what type of vehicle? How much information is going to be put in the officer's narrative? Do we have anything we need to put in the diagram, the collision diagram that officers do, those sorts of things. So those are all big questions that we're trying to work through, and something that is a lot more complicated than it seems. And last I heard, there hasn't been an official resolution yet. So if someone knows of one that I haven't heard of, please feel free to share that with us in the chat, and I will mention at the end of the presentation. And then kind of the other big piece of data collection and standardization is what data we receive from the companies themselves, and how can we use that data for our planning efforts. So first of all, we need to make sure that we know, what kind of format we're getting that in. And I think I really have to credit Indianapolis on this. They were pretty big leaders in terms of trying to get some data from the e-scooter companies. And I know they've partnered with Purdue University and done some pretty good research and data analysis types of efforts. There have been several presentations about that at Purdue's Road School. So if any of you watching this haven't caught those and are interested, you might see if you can check the Road School archives and see what you can find there. There's a lot of really interesting information and data analysis that's been done. And so that's just something we want to continue to monitor going forward. Like I said, Indianapolis was one of the first big areas to receive it here in the state, so they've really been a leader in that, so we thank them for that. All right, so sustainability and resilience. So this is kind of something that you may not necessarily think about when you think about e-scooters. You may think, oh, okay, yeah, they aren't gas powered, they're electric powered, so there may be some savings there, but what are the real savings with e-scooters or other types of micromobility? So the first thing that I would say is that studies do suggest that younger generations want to walk as a means of transportation. And not only do they want to walk, but as those of us who live near college campuses have seen, some of them just want to ride on these e-scooters. And I have here this link as an example of just an article on a study that kind of indicates some of this information. There are several others that you can find as well. I just picked one as an example. But people definitely want to use methods of transportation other than motor vehicles. And that really provides us with a great opportunity for sustainability and resilience and making sure that we have a system that accommodates that. So it's one of those situations where it's like, if you build it, they will come. I don't know, maybe they should use that in a movie or something, might be a good quote. Perhaps I'll call up some of my Hollywood friends that I definitely know, and we'll see if I can work one into something, I don't know. But yeah, so kind of with that framework, I just want to remind us all of something I think that we know, and that is that design that complies with ADA standards is good for everyone. So if you can create a design that's friendly for people with mobility challenges, it's friendly for everyone. One big thing that discourages people from walking or taking e-scooters or any other non-motorized method of transportation is that they just don't feel very safe. So what we want to avoid is kind of the situation that I have here in this picture, where you can see this sign that says state law stop for pedestrians and crosswalk has seen much better days. It looks like it's been hit more than once in order to achieve that level of scuffing and markups and so on. So, if you see that as a pedestrian, that's kind of a clue of, well, wait a minute now, this says that people are supposed to stop, but based on this sign, it doesn't look like they're stopping. So maybe I'm, not going to walk next time if I've seen this once. Maybe I'm going to choose, instead of walking next time, I'm just going to get in my car because I don't feel safe walking in this area. So that's what we really want to avoid. So the question that I want to ask is, how can we improve on this? So I have some more information on that on upcoming slides. So first of all, I'd like to kind of start with just some observations about what we see here in this picture. So what it shows us is that there's a really very open feel right now. It looks like maybe there are some provisions for parking, but at least when this picture was taken, there's not really anybody parked. Now, there's also not a lot of traffic, which is nice, but that may be a situation where it leads to people thinking, oh, I can drive through here really quickly. And speed is something that's very, very dangerous for vulnerable users, such as pedestrians, e-scooter riders, people like that. Also, just one thing that was interesting to me is that the sidewalk is a lot wider on the left of the picture. I'm going to try to use my cursor to highlight it there. Hopefully you can see it. But in front of those buildings, because of the kind of the setbacks, there's really a much wider sidewalk than there is on the opposite side of the street, where there isn't quite as much space. Additionally, there's not really very much green infrastructure in this particular picture. It's just a little bit hard to maybe get it in this area. I don't know where this picture was taken, honestly, but wherever it is, it's not a lot of green. You see a lot of pavement, you see a lot of concrete, right? So that's something that's not really very sustainable, very resilient, as we've been discussing throughout this conference. On the plus side, it does include some ADA ramps, which you can see if you look at the top left of the picture there that I'm trying to circle right now. There is an ADA ramp there, so that is a positive. That's something that's definitely good and that we're glad to see. So then the next question I think we want to ask ourselves is, okay, what can we do to improve this? What are some potential improvements for this area? So anytime you're looking at making something more pedestrian friendly, I think kind of the first general thing you're looking at is some traffic calming measures. So what can we do to make it so that, vehicles feel like they don't necessarily want to speed through here going 100 miles an hour, but that vehicles will go at a speed that's appropriate for the area. So there are many different kinds of traffic calming measures you could use, bump outs, on-street parking, those sorts of things. It looks like maybe to me like there is some capacity for on-street parking, but maybe kind of making that a little more utilized, things along those lines. Another thing that could be a good idea is to do an on-site ADA audit. Anytime you're looking at just a picture, that never really gives you everything that you need. In order to really properly get a feel of an intersection, you have to go to the site itself. And so because of that, that's something that could really give a lot of benefits of saying, okay, what are the real issues here at this area? What are things that we might not be able to see in a picture that we can see by going out and observing the intersection? And then that may lead to some good ideas, and specifically just some good ways to choose which traffic calming measures to implement. Additionally, adding a clear zone or buffer zone, whatever you want to call it, which is a great place for amenities. So especially if we look at that sidewalk on the left, there is a lot of space, but there's no real way to separate pedestrians from the traffic except for the parking, which isn't being used. But what if there was maybe some benches or something for people to sit on when they were walking, or some bike racks for them to park their bicycles, or an e-scooter parking spot, or something along those lines. That would really encourage people to use those types of transportation, to get out of their cars, to take these other methods of transportation that would really reduce trips in vehicles that have some of the harmful emissions that we've heard about earlier today. And so, whatever you want to call that, clear zone, buffer zone, there are several different terms for it that I've seen. Those are a couple that I've seen regularly, so I chose those for the presentation, but whatever you want to call it. And then the other thing is to add some green infrastructure. And you can even do that within the clear zone. You can easily plant trees there. That's a great place for them. We've heard about permeable pavement, some of the successes that Lafayette has had using that. We heard a great example of that earlier. And those sorts of things are things that we would really like to see at this type of intersection that could really make it a lot more friendly, a lot more walkable, that would really improve it and make it an attractive thing for people to use, an intersection that people want to walk to, a place that's more vibrant, a place that's not just where we go out to get in our cars and drive to, but something where there are people, where there's activity. And then the other thing I would mention is that policies can help us too. So this is an emerging field. There's really an opportunity for us to set a precedent with ordinances. So e-scooters, micromobility devices like that haven't been around for all that long. They've been within the last few years. So it's still something that there are definitely opportunities for improvements. So if we remember the ideas table from earlier, that had several different ways that we can implement some positive changes, some positive things that will help make sure that the transportation system can be utilized by everyone. So not only folks with mobility challenges, but anyone else who wants to use them. And then that can be something that you can really kind of use as an example if you have a good one. So if you get a good ordinance that other people say, wow, I'm really impressed with how e-scooters and micromobility devices are integrated with the transportation system in city X that I visited, how can I translate that to my area, or what are they doing that's so great that's helping these really run smoothly and be effective there? So that's kind of the question that I think we're asking. And then looking forward, what technological advancements will be coming next? What's the next thing going to be? Is the next thing going to be more about improving the e-scooters themselves or other micromobility devices, or is it going to be something totally brand new? And how can Indiana be a leader or an example in implementing some new technologies that promote sustainability and resilience? What if we get e-scooters that don't take as much energy to charge up at night or things like that? How can we implement those sorts of things? How can we get them together and be a place where they are part of the integrated transportation system, but that they're safe, that they're effective? So I had to sneak in a quote from a baseball player in honor of the MLB playoffs starting today. So a person always doing his or her best becomes a natural leader just by example. So I think that really applies to what we're talking about here, especially in this kind of emerging field where if we set good policy, if we have good operations, if we embrace technology, we can really be a great example of how we can have a transportation system that's multimodal, that people can choose to make trips by methods other than vehicles that put out all these harmful emissions into the environment, and that's really vibrant and livable in a place that people want to be. The sorts of things we're always talking about as planners, right? And just leading by example, I think, can be pretty powerful in terms of that. Okay, so this is my last slide. I do have my contact info up. So I just want to encourage everyone to partner with us. There's a couple of different ways you can do that. So one is by sending some examples of best practices. So if you've seen something that you think is particularly good in your area and you want to highlight that, you want to brag about it, I'm giving you a chance to brag about how great your area is and how much better it is than everyone else. And everyone wants to do that, right? So, if there's something awesome going on in your area, we'd love to hear about that and maybe integrate that into some of the work we're doing. That would be extremely helpful for what I was talking about earlier with our ordinance development work, as well as our data standardization. So best practices with either of those things would be awesome. Also, you're welcome to join the committee. This is not something that has a closed roster. We're always excited to have new people join us to hear their ideas. So if you want to do that, just drop me an email, maybe say e-scooter ADA ordinance committee or something in the subject line, just something along those lines so that I know, what it's about. And then I'll be happy to give you more information. I'm also happy to share the ideas table that I showed some excerpts from earlier, if that's something you're interested in. So with that, I think it's time for any questions. So do we have any questions that came in the chat pod during the presentation?
Yes, we do have 2 questions. They're a bit similar, so I'll just ask the first one first. This is from Megan McClellan. She says, currently our e-scooters geolocators are not specific enough to differentiate sidewalk from street. Are other brands?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I can't tell you that I have heard of one that's that good yet. What I can tell you is that this is an area where there are pretty rapid technological advancements. So some of the early models of e-scooters that companies would deploy didn't even have that kind of capability at all. So the fact that we've kind of gotten from no capability to some capability, I think is encouraging. Now, it may still be something where that's a little bit of a pipe dream with that kind of technology example. But there may be other ways where we can still leverage that sort of thing, where we say, okay, we know that perhaps a certain area of like a campus or something, we really want scooters off of, we want that to be only a pedestrian area. And that's something that maybe, because it's a little bit of a larger area, that at least we could get, and that would still give us some benefit, even though it wouldn't necessarily differentiate between bike lane versus sidewalk. Do we have any other questions?
Yes, I think you may have answered David Armstrong's question here, who asks, how accurate is the GIS on scooters for geofencing?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like any other GPS sort of system. There is a tolerance of, I don't want to give you an exact number because I don't know off the top of my head, so I don't want to tell you incorrectly. But there is a tolerance of, enough that it's still not really realistic, from what I know, to differentiate between sidewalk versus the bike lane, or maybe even a sidewalk versus a trail if you had a couple of those side by side. Or I know there are some places in West Lafayette where there's a sidewalk that's runs pretty close to a trail, or this bike path, I should say. That sort of thing isn't necessarily easy to differentiate right now, again, from what I know. I'm not on the front lines of that specifically, so I'm not really the right person. But I know that the committee does have some people on it who do work pretty closely with e-scooter providers directly. So if this is something that's a topic of interest, we're certainly happy to reach out to representatives from organizations that have deployed devices in Indiana and ask them about that. So that's a great thing. If you want to email me about that, I'm more than happy to include it on our next agenda for our December meeting, and happy to talk about that. Is that all the questions?
I do not see any more questions at this time.